When I was younger, birthdays meant balloons, cheap frosting, and being reminded that love, real love, was conditional in our home. My name is Brielle Monroe, and by the time I was 8, I had memorized what neglect tasted like. Not hunger, exactly, but the aching absence of being seen. In our house, attention wasn't given, it was earned. And no matter how hard I tried, I never quite collected enough invisible points to win it. My younger brother, Caleb, never had that problem. He was the golden child, the miracle baby, the one who saved my parents' marriage after years of strain. Mom used to say he was her second chance. I used to wonder what that made me, an early regret. At school, I thrived. I built perfect attendance records, wrote essays that made teachers pause, and led every group project with quiet precision. But none of it translated into pride at home. Caleb could spill orange juice all over his science project and still get a standing ovation for effort. I once brought home a county-wide art award, and my mother barely looked up from her phone. "That's nice, Brielle," she murmured. "Make sure you don't leave paint on the carpet." I learned early that invisibility wasn't a superpower, it was a sentence. Years passed, and my coping mechanism became achievement. I didn't scream for attention, I whispered my worth through scholarships, certificates, and eventually, a full ride to a top university. I packed my own bags, arranged my own move, and left without fanfare. No one shed tears. My father gave a distracted thumbs up as I loaded the last box into the cab. Caleb, then a senior in high school, didn't even glance up from his gaming console. College was the first time I felt oxygen fill my lungs. My roommate cried the day her mom left after helping decorate the dorm. I didn't understand the emotion then. I'd never seen affection expressed without conditions. But something in me softened at the sight, a hope I didn't know I still carried. I majored in computer engineering. I picked it not because it was my dream, but because it was lucrative, logical, and guaranteed to keep me out of dependence. I graduated at the top of my class. My parents didn't attend. Flights are expensive. My mother texted, followed by a Venmo request for $72 to cover Caleb's prom tux. So I stopped inviting them. I built a life in Austin, carved from discipline and distance. I landed a job at a rising tech startup, made 6 figures before 30, and bought my own condo with money I didn't have to ask permission to spend. And still, I caught myself hesitating before posting accomplishments online, fearing they'd twist it into guilt. "Must be nice," they'd say. "Wish you could help out more with Caleb's tuition." Help. That word always came with a hook. Then came the invitation. Or rather, the lack of one. It was the winter Caleb got engaged. I found out on Instagram, scrolling absently until a diamond flashed across the screen in her perfectly manicured fingers. The caption read, "He asked." I said yes. "Can't wait to spend forever with my best friend." Dozens of likes. Comments from old high school classmates. And there, buried 3 rows down, my own mother, so proud of my baby boy. "Raised you right." I blinked at the screen. Checked my messages. Nothing. No text. No call. No email. Just digital confetti in a world I wasn't invited to. I waited a day, then another. On day 4, I caved and called my mother. She answered on the 4th ring, distracted. "Brielle? Everything okay?" "I saw Caleb's post," I said carefully. "Oh. Isn't it wonderful? Were you going to tell me?" A pause. "We figured you'd see it online." I couldn't speak. "Don't take it personally," she added. "You've been so busy. We didn't think you'd want to come back for a small gathering." A small gathering, that was how she described the engagement party. A full event hall. Caterers. Live music. 50 guests. All without me. "Thanks for letting me know," I said flatly and hung up before the ache in my throat could give itself away. That night, I poured a glass of wine I couldn't taste and stared at the blinking cursor on a work email I couldn't answer. My world was balanced on independence, but even independence, when built in isolation, gets lonely. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was tired of earning love that never arrived. Tired of proving myself to people who refused to see. Tired of thinking that one more accomplishment might finally unlock approval, but this time, something cracked, not my heart. My tolerance. I'd spent years believing I had to stay quiet to stay sane. But now, I realized silence had been their shield, not mine, and I was done holding it up for them. The following week dragged like wet fabric against skin, heavy, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. I buried myself in back-to-back project deadlines, overcompensating for the emptiness clawing inside me. On Friday afternoon, my boss complimented a clean product rollout, said I was the only developer who consistently delivered ahead of schedule. I smiled, nodded, thanked her politely. Inside, I felt nothing. Praise had become a transaction I was numb to, a currency I couldn't spend on the things that hurt the most. That evening, my phone buzzed again. A text from my father, whose digital presence only ever showed up when responsibility knocked. It read, "Hey Brielle, Caleb and his fiancée are looking to buy a starter home. Thought you could help with the down payment? Just until they get settled. No hello. No, how are you? Just a request, served like an invoice. Not a question. An expectation. I didn't reply immediately. I stared at the message for over an hour, rereading it until my eyes burned. My own father hadn't congratulated me on my promotion, hadn't called me since Christmas 2 years ago, but now he was comfortable asking for tens of thousands of dollars like we were part of some functioning emotional economy. I thought about the times I'd eaten ramen for 2 weeks just to cover rent during my internship, the years I went without vacations, the overtime I poured into financial freedom. None of it was enough to earn autonomy in their eyes. If I had money, it belonged to the family. If I had time, it should be spent fixing what they'd broken. If I had boundaries, I was selfish. I typed, erased, then finally sent, "I'm not in a position to help financially right now. Hope you understand." That was a lie. I was absolutely in a position to help, but I was also in a position to say no. The response came quickly, "You make 6 figures, Brielle. This isn't about money. It's about family." That word again. Family. A weapon in their hands. A leash disguised as love. I didn't reply. The next morning, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the building security hadn't called ahead. Peeking through the peephole, I saw Caleb standing there, hands in his jacket pockets, expression stiff with frustration. I opened the door slowly. "Hey," he said flatly, not meeting my gaze. "Mom said you didn't want to help with the house." His tone wasn't inquisitive, it was accusatory. "That's right," I answered, voice neutral. "I'm choosing not to." He blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" I tilted my head slightly, examining the brother who had spent his life being lifted, carried, protected, by everyone, including me. "It means I'm not responsible for funding your next milestone," I replied. "I've done enough." He scoffed. "You're being dramatic. It's a small loan. You act like you've never needed help." I stepped back, opening the door wider. "Actually, I never got help. That's the difference." He opened his mouth, probably to deflect, but I didn't give him the space. "Do you remember who paid for my college books? My housing? My groceries? Me. All of it. And when I graduated, do you know what Mom sent me? A forwarded link to Caleb's GoFundMe for prom expenses." The look on his face wavered slightly. Not with guilt. With disbelief that I would dare say it out loud. I continued, "I'm not an ATM. I'm not a backup plan. And I'm not funding your future just because you coasted through your past." He stepped back like my words physically shoved him. "Wow. So that's what you think of me?" I shrugged. "I think you've been handed a lot. And I think it's time you learned what it feels like to stand on your own." He didn't respond, just turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps stiff with indignation. I closed the door quietly. No slamming. No dramatic sigh. Just a quiet, satisfying click as the lock turned behind him. That night, I finally went through the wedding website. I hadn't been given the link, I had found it through a tagged photo someone else posted. It was a lavish event. Black tie dress code. RSVP only. My name was nowhere on the guest list. Not only had they planned the engagement party without me, they were now hosting a full wedding with 200 guests and hadn't even bothered to pretend I mattered. A part of me wanted to cry. Not because I wanted to go, but because for so long, I believed if I just succeeded enough, they'd notice. If I was useful, I'd be worthy. If I was exceptional, I'd finally be included, but I was done bargaining with ghosts. The next morning, I received an email from a family friend, a woman who used to babysit us when we were children. She congratulated me on my new job, said she'd heard about the wedding, and hoped I'd be attending. "Your parents must be so proud," she wrote. I laughed out loud. Not a joyful laugh. A bitter one. The kind that comes out when you realize people will believe the narrative most convenient to them. No one saw the nights I stayed up calculating interest payments. No one saw the sacrifices. They only saw the polished outcome, and assumed it was gifted. That night, something shifted inside me again. Not out of spite, but clarity. They wanted me to be the invisible engine. The ghost who paid bills. The name never spoken but always used. But I was done playing the role of the helpful outsider in a family who only valued what I gave them, not who I was. If they wanted separation, I'd give it to them, only this time, I'd be the one writing the terms. 2 weeks passed without contact. And I thought, perhaps naively, that the storm had moved past. That maybe, for once, my boundaries had been accepted without pushback. I was wrong. It started with a letter, an envelope tucked beneath a stack of promotional flyers outside my door, bearing the logo of a mortgage lender I'd never done business with. At first, I thought it was spam. Then I saw my name printed at the top of the enclosed document, followed by terms, interest rates, and, most jarringly, a repayment schedule. My heart began pounding as I read through it, each line a punch to the chest. It was a loan agreement. A real one. Legally binding. And I had apparently co-signed it, except, I hadn't. My hands trembled as I scanned page after page. Everything looked legitimate: my full legal name, my social security number, a digital signature that mimicked mine perfectly. It had been filed under a joint agreement with 2 other parties. I recognized both names immediately: my parents. Panic set in. I called the number listed on the letter, trying to remain calm as I asked to verify the origination of the file. The woman on the other end was polite, helpful, efficient. She confirmed my involvement on the paperwork, and when I told her I had no memory of signing anything, she paused. It was e-signed through a third-party authorization service, she explained. We have an IP address on file for each signer. I requested the data. An hour later, I had the report in my inbox. My IP address, the one from my home in Austin, was not among them. But the one tied to my parents' house appeared twice. I sat frozen at my desk, mouth dry, stomach in knots. They had forged my identity. Used my credit history. Exploited my financial standing. And they hadn't even told me. The call to my mother was brief. "Hi, sweetheart," she said cheerfully, as if we hadn't spoken weeks ago under frosted silence. "Did you sign my name on a mortgage application?" Silence, the kind that doesn't come from confusion, but from getting caught. "Brielle, did you use my credit to secure a loan for Caleb's house?" She sighed. Not remorsefully. More like someone inconvenienced. "We were going to tell you." "When?" "After the paperwork cleared. You wouldn't have helped otherwise." I gripped the edge of my desk. "You committed fraud." "Don't be dramatic," she snapped. "It's your brother. We didn't want him to start married life in debt. So instead, you decided to risk my credit score? My legal liability? You're overreacting." I hung up. No screaming. No threats. Just a click. The next call was to a lawyer. A friend of a friend, someone I'd met at a tech conference who specialized in digital fraud cases. I sent him everything: copies of the documents, the IP verification, a summary of events. He replied within hours, "You have a strong case. Want me to file a claim?" I stared at that message for nearly half an hour. Filing would mean consequences. For them, but not filing would mean consequences. For me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, heart bruised by betrayal so vast it didn't even feel personal anymore. It felt systemic. Generational. Like I had been born into a family where theft wore the mask of love, where guilt was currency, and where my autonomy was always optional, if it served their agenda. The next morning, I answered my lawyer's message with 2 words: do it. What followed was a storm I had braced for my whole life but had never actually initiated. When my parents were served, the phone calls started immediately. First came the denial, then the deflection. My father said it was all a misunderstanding. My mother insisted it was a clerical error. Caleb texted me 3 paragraphs about how I was tearing the family apart. I didn't respond. I let the truth speak in court filings. Weeks passed. They stopped calling. The silence wasn't peace, it was pressure. I could feel it, like a vice around my ribs, designed to make me feel like the aggressor. Like the villain, but I wasn't the one who committed fraud. I was the one who refused to be silenced by it. One afternoon, as I walked home from a meeting, I passed a family of 3 in the park, parents laughing as their daughter shrieked joyfully, chasing bubbles. For a split second, I felt grief. Not jealousy. Grief for the version of me that once believed I could earn that kind of warmth through effort. That if I just achieved enough, they'd love me without conditions. That version of me had died. What remained was someone clearer. Sharper. Unapologetic. The next week, I contacted all 3 major credit bureaus and froze my accounts. I locked down every financial avenue they might have accessed. I paid off my remaining student loans, not because I had to, but because I wanted 0 strings left connecting me to their legacy. Then I changed my phone number and moved, not because I was hiding, but because I was finally choosing peace. The final letter from the court came 2 months later. Charges were filed. A hearing was set. I stared at the date, circled it on my calendar, then did something I hadn't done in years. I booked a week-long vacation, just for myself, somewhere with sunlight, silence, and no obligations, and for the first time in decades, I exhaled without fear of what would come next. The day of the hearing arrived draped in a gray sky, as if the atmosphere itself knew what kind of emotional storm was about to unfold. I dressed simply: black slacks, a navy blouse, no jewelry. Not because I wanted to appear austere, but because I had nothing to prove. I wasn't there to perform, I was there to reclaim. When I entered the courthouse, a deep calm settled over me, not the absence of fear, but the presence of clarity. I checked in with the bailiff, sat quietly on the hard bench, and waited. 15 minutes later, I saw them walk in. My mother, shoulders drawn up as if expecting sympathy. My father, trying to look composed but clearly uncomfortable in his borrowed suit. Caleb wasn't with them, which surprised me until I realized he probably didn't want to be seen as complicit in front of strangers. Convenient, they avoided eye contact, which suited me just fine. I wasn't there to trade glances or rehash history in the waiting room. I was there for accountability, something I'd been denied my entire life. The court clerk called the case number, and we stepped forward. My lawyer, composed and razor-sharp, opened with facts. No theatrics. Just data. The IP logs showing. The location from which the fraudulent application had been signed. The timestamps that coincided perfectly with when I was demonstrably logged into work servers in a different state. The digital signature analysis, which showed subtle but clear inconsistencies with my authentic handwriting. It wasn't speculation, it was undeniable. My parents' attorney, a man I'd never seen before, likely hired in a last-minute scramble, attempted to deflect. He argued that the signatures could have been authorized verbally. That I may have given consent informally. That families often make decisions collaboratively without realizing the legal technicalities involved. My attorney didn't even flinch. Consent without documentation is not legally binding, she said smoothly. This is not a debate about emotional misunderstandings. It's identity theft. When it was time for them to speak, my mother's voice wavered. Your Honor, she began, we are not criminals. We are parents. We made a mistake, but it wasn't malicious. We just wanted to help our son start his life on the right foot. Brielle always seemed so successful, so distant, we thought she wouldn't mind. Her voice cracked, like she expected that break to soften the blow. I didn't flinch. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with a direct gaze and no tolerance for theatrics, leaned forward slightly. So you admit to using her name and credit without her express consent? My mother hesitated. My father answered for her. Yes, but we didn't think it would hurt anyone. The judge paused. Intent does not negate impact, she said sharply. You not only breached financial trust, you violated the law. And your justification seems to be that you assumed your daughter's success meant she owed you access to her identity. That's not how legal systems work. That's not how families should operate, either. I felt something loosen inside me. Not joy. Not vindication. Just relief. Like someone had finally named the sickness I'd been gaslighted into ignoring for decades. Then came the sentencing. Because it was a first-time offense and technically classified as nonviolent financial fraud, the punishment wasn't prison. It was mandatory restitution, full repayment of the loan balance, and 6 months of supervised financial counseling. My parents would also carry a permanent mark on their credit history, barring them from taking out new lines of credit without third-party review for the foreseeable future. As the judge concluded, she looked directly at me. Ms. Monroe, you exercised a right many in your position do not. Most victims of familial fraud stay silent out of guilt. But you stood up for your autonomy. That takes courage. I hope this resolution brings you peace. I nodded once, barely able to swallow past the lump rising in my throat. The courtroom emptied slowly. My parents lingered by the door, unsure if they should approach. I gave them nothing. Not a word. Not a look. Not a single gesture of reconciliation. They had brought this on themselves, and no courtroom decree could reverse the years they spent eroding my trust. Outside, my lawyer handed me a folder with the official documents. You did the right thing, she said quietly. I nodded. I know. As I walked away from the courthouse, the air felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but honest. There were no illusions left. No lingering fantasies about redemption or miraculous apologies. What remained was clarity. A cold, clean truth. That no longer twisted itself into guilt. Later that evening, I sat on my balcony, sipping tea as the sun dipped behind the skyline. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It read, "You embarrassed the family. Hope it was worth it." I deleted it without replying. That act alone felt like a revolution, not because I silenced them, but because I refused to let them speak into a space they no longer deserved access to. Summer arrived with suffocating heat, but I welcomed the discomfort. It reminded me I was still alive. Still capable of rebuilding from beneath the rubble of a family that had once felt like home but now resembled a well-dressed crime scene. I had spent months untangling legal threads, fortifying my financial identity, and mentally preparing myself for the fallout. But there was one event looming like a thunderhead: Caleb's wedding. It was the apex of their narrative, the culmination of every excuse they ever made for choosing him over me. And I wasn't invited. Not that I expected to be. Still, the universe has a funny way of reopening old wounds just when you think they've scarred over. A colleague at work, someone from my marketing department who didn't know the depths of my personal history, mentioned they'd seen my brother's wedding featured in a luxury venue blog. Apparently, the event was sponsored by a new hospitality startup looking for social media traction. The photos were everywhere. Crisp, high-resolution shots of handcrafted name cards, champagne towers, a 5-tier cake imported from an LA boutique. Caleb and his fiancée stood grinning under a floral arch that probably cost more than I made during my entire first year as a junior developer. And my parents? Front row, beaming like they'd raised royalty. There was no sign of absence. No indication that someone had been cut out of the frame. That someone was me. My initial reaction wasn't sadness, it was calculation. Not revenge. Not pettiness. Precision. If they wanted me erased, then I would become unforgettable. And not through noise or confrontation, but through achievement. Through scale. 3 days later, I flew to San Francisco to finalize an acquisition deal. My company had been quietly eyeing a mid-sized tech firm known for its proprietary user behavior algorithms, perfect for our new AI-based analytics suite. The final signing took place in a minimalistic conference room with a sweeping view of the bay. As I signed my name, I realized I had just secured full equity stake in a company that would catapult our valuation well beyond what anyone, including my family, imagined I was capable of. And then, I made a phone call, not to gloat. Not to announce anything. But to set one small, strategic motion into place. My assistant reached out to the wedding venue's parent company, the same hospitality startup that had partnered with Caleb's wedding for promo purposes. Turns out, they had recently begun licensing their services for corporate events. I booked the exact same location. Full VIP buyout. Only this time, not for a wedding. For a tech summit. My tech summit. 2 weeks before the event, the venue's social media began promoting it heavily, excited to host Betrayal Monroe, founder of Polaris Data Labs, for our first private innovation forum. My name. My brand. My terms. It was subtle, but effective. A few extended family members who followed me on LinkedIn reached out with curiosity, asking if I was doing something in events now. I didn't respond. I let them wonder. Let them. Google. On the morning of the summit, I arrived early. The venue had been transformed, clean lines, atmospheric lighting, interactive demo stations. It was elegant but unpretentious. Every detail intentional. And as I stood backstage preparing to deliver my keynote to a room full of investors, journalists, and industry peers, I thought about how far I had come. Not just geographically. Emotionally. Spiritually. Strategically, the presentation was a success. Press coverage followed. TechCrunch ran a feature titled, The Architect of Insight, How Betrayal Monroe Quietly Built the Smartest Data Engine in the Game. I didn't smile when I read it, I exhaled. It was validation, yes, but more than that, it was a declaration. I was no longer asking to be seen. I had built something too powerful to be ignored. 3 days after the summit, I received a voicemail. It was Caleb. I know you probably won't call back, he began, voice low and halting, but I saw the article. Everyone's talking about you. Mom's, she's a mess. Says she didn't realize what you were building. Says you should have told us. I replayed the message twice. Not because I was tempted to respond, but because I wanted to memorize. The tone. The edge of regret in someone who had only ever known entitlement. The crack in confidence when the golden child realizes the spotlight has moved. They hadn't just underestimated me, they'd built an entire hierarchy assuming I'd never rise above the floor they kept pushing me beneath. I deleted the message, not out of anger, but finality. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine, opened a blank document on my laptop, and began drafting a manifesto, not for publication, but for myself. A manifesto outlining every lesson I had learned about loyalty, boundaries, resilience, and the cost of silence. It wasn't about healing. Healing implies returning to some earlier state of wholeness. I wasn't returning. I was reconstructing, because this wasn't a comeback. It was a recalibration, and they had no idea what was coming next. The week after the summit felt strangely quiet, as if the chaos had burned itself out and left behind a hollow calm. My inbox overflowed with interview requests, brand partnership offers, and pitches from venture capitalists eager to get a slice of whatever came next. Yet through it all, I felt untethered. Accomplishment didn't taste sweet when your name echoed through spaces your family still refused to acknowledge. I wasn't looking for validation anymore, but the silence from people who once defined every corner of my childhood echoed louder than any applause. That silence cracked one morning with a single email, subject line, "It's probably too late," but I had to try. It was from my cousin Nadia. We hadn't spoken in years. Not since she left for Chicago, disappeared from the family radar, and was labeled difficult by everyone over Sunday dinners. I always thought she was dramatic, maybe a little selfish, maybe just bad at playing the family politics game. But now I knew better. Her message was short. Just a few lines. Betrayal, I saw what happened. I've seen what they've done. I left. Years ago for the same reason. I didn't have the proof you did, but I had the gut instinct. Can we talk? Just once. I don't want anything from you, just to tell you what they won't. My hand hovered over the reply button. I wasn't sure if I was ready to pull apart more layers of deception. But curiosity, the kind born from years of gaslighting and half-truths, won out. I agreed to meet her that weekend at a quiet cafe tucked inside a bookstore. She arrived before I did, sitting near a window with a mug of herbal tea and eyes that looked simultaneously exhausted and relieved. She smiled when she saw me, but it was a cautious smile. The kind you wear when you're not sure if you're forgiven. Thanks for coming, she said, standing to offer a hug. I accepted, awkwardly at first, but it didn't take long for the warmth of shared understanding to cut through years of distance. She wasted no time. I found a check once, she began, hands wrapped tightly around her mug. Made out to me. Dated 6 months after I graduated. Never delivered. I only saw it because I was helping Mom clean out a drawer, and it was hidden between 2 insurance policies. Grandma had left me $5,000 to help with rent and job hunting. I never got it. Aunt Marlene, that's your mom, convinced everyone I was already set up and didn't need it. I sat in silence, listening. She told them I was living with some rich guy. That I was irresponsible with money. She spun this story that made everyone think I'd just wasted my chances. But I was working 3 part-time jobs, Betrayal. I was scraping by. And they let me drown. On purpose. Nadia paused, her voice shaking now. So I left. Moved to a different state. Cut ties. Changed my number. I couldn't fight them because I didn't have proof, and fighting without proof makes you look like the bitter one. My throat tightened. Her story mirrored mine more than I'd ever anticipated. I used to think I was the broken one, she said. But watching how they treated you, that summit? That court case? It confirmed everything I was too afraid to say out loud. I nodded slowly. They make you feel like you imagined it. Like you're being cruel for noticing the imbalance. Exactly, she whispered. They weaponize shame. The conversation stretched for 2 hours. We traded stories like soldiers. Comparing scars. By the end of it, I didn't just feel validated, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. Nadia wasn't looking to rekindle some lost bond for nostalgia's sake. She wanted truth. So did I. Before we parted, she reached into her purse and handed me a manila envelope. I don't know if this helps, but you should see it. Inside were printed screenshots of group chats, family threads I had long been removed from. Texts about me. Cold, calculated remarks. My name reduced to a punchline. She's too proud to ask for help. Let her struggle. If she wanted to be part of the family, she wouldn't act like she's above us. Let's just say she wasn't invited. Easier than pretending. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. These weren't just miscommunications. They were decisions. Coordinated and cruel. Nadia touched my hand lightly. You're not imagining the pattern. They write people out when they stop being useful. You just happened to be the first one who had the receipts. I walked away from that cafe with the envelope tucked under my arm like a loaded weapon, not to be used out of spite, but to protect my sanity. Because in this war for emotional survival, truth was armor. That night, I went home and pulled out an old photo album. Pages of holidays, birthdays, graduations. I wasn't absent in them. I was just peripheral. Always near the edge of the frame. Always slightly turned away, as if even then, my body knew the story would never center around me. Until now that I didn't feel bitter. I felt prepared to write the ending myself. For once, weeks passed, but the fire inside me didn't dim, it crystallized. Gone was the sharp sting of betrayal. What remained was a cold, calculated clarity. I wasn't chasing an apology anymore. I wasn't interested in reconciliation, closure, or mutual understanding. What I wanted now was accountability, not through arguments or passive-aggressive remarks at future gatherings, but through deliberate, undeniable contrast. I wanted them to look directly at what they had discarded and see what they'd lost, and I knew exactly how to make that happen. It started with an idea, an audacious one. My company had been steadily expanding into new markets, and I was in the early stages of organizing a private investor dinner to announce our global expansion. Originally, it was supposed to be a closed-door affair, select partners, strategic media, and venture capital power players. But I saw an opportunity. What if I invited every person who had ever doubted me? Not just the colleagues who once called me overambitious in whispered meetings, or the investors who said I lacked leadership presence. No, I wanted to include the family members who used to label me difficult, dramatic, detached. The very people who hosted holiday dinners without me while still feeling entitled to the credit cards I paid off. The event would be lavish, but tasteful. Not for the sake of showing off, but to make the difference undeniable. I hired the same caterer Caleb used at his wedding. I booked the same string quartet my mother once praised on Facebook. I even secured the same florist who had decorated their backyard for my sister-in-law's baby shower. Every detail would be familiar, except this time, I was the center of it all. Then came the invitations. They weren't sent by email. No, had them printed, letterpress on thick, custom cardstock, embossed with silver foil. They arrived in wax-sealed envelopes, addressed individually, with no mention of +1s or family welcome. The message was direct. Betrayal Monroe invites you to an exclusive investor experience to unveil the next chapter of Polaris Data Labs. Business formal. Silence not required. Most of them thought it was a mistake. That they'd been added to the list by accident. A few texted, trying to confirm the invitation's authenticity. I didn't respond. If they wanted answers, they could show up, and they did. The evening of the event, the ballroom shimmered in gold and midnight tones. Candles lined the long oak tables, their flickering flames dancing in crystal holders. The air smelled like bergamot and ambition. The guest list included tech leaders, editors from Forbes and Inc., 2 state senators, and even a former CEO of a Fortune 100 firm who'd recently joined our board. And then came the faces from my past, hesitant, uncertain, overdressed. My mother wore the same blue shawl she'd flaunted at Caleb's wedding. My father looked like he was walking into a deposition. A few cousins clung together near the champagne table, clearly uncomfortable but too curious to leave. They didn't understand why they were there until the keynote. I stepped onto the stage, the spotlight soft but unflinching. No teleprompter. No notes. Just my voice and a story I finally had the power to narrate. I used to believe that success would earn me love. I began, scanning the room. That if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, made myself small enough, maybe then I'd be welcome at the table. Murmurs rippled. My mother shifted uncomfortably. But what I've learned, I continued, is that love given under conditions is not love. It's control. And silence, no matter how graceful, is not noble, it's complicity. So tonight isn't just about business. It's about making noise. I laid out the numbers, growth trajectories, new partnerships, projected market expansion. But I also shared my story. Not the sanitized version, but the raw blueprint of what it takes to be erased by your own blood and still build an empire from scratch. I spoke of the courtroom, the wedding, the stolen identity, the voicemail from Caleb, the envelope from Nadia. Didn't name them directly, but they knew. Every word I spoke reassembled a broken narrative they had twisted for their convenience. Every statistic I cited was a rebuttal to years of their disdain. Every applause from the audience rang like a verdict. By the time I left the stage, the applause wasn't just loud, it was long. After the speech, I didn't mingle. I slipped into a private lounge, letting my team handle press inquiries. I wanted them to stew in the ballroom with nothing but their discomfort and the realization that this version of me, the unashamed, uninvited, unstoppable one, wasn't going anywhere. Later that night, I checked my phone. 12 missed calls. 6 from my mother. 2 voicemails. 1 text from a cousin. We didn't know. If we had, we would have never, but they had known. They just didn't care, until not caring became embarrassing. That was the difference. They weren't sorry for what they did, they were sorry it no longer worked. It was 2 days after the event when the knock came, soft, uncertain, as if the person on the other side wasn't sure they had the right address. I had just finished a virtual meeting with our European legal team, my laptop still open, the cursor blinking on a press release draft I couldn't bring myself to finish. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for company. But the knock came again. I hesitated, instinctively checking the security cam feed on my phone. And there she was, my mother, standing outside the gate in a beige wool coat too heavy for the spring weather, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like a child who had finally realized she was lost. I didn't open the door right away. I watched for several minutes, long enough to notice the strain in her posture, the way she rocked slightly on her heels like she was debating turning around. Then she looked up directly at the camera lens, eyes red, but not from the cold. And in that moment, I saw the smallest fracture in the polished, unbothered exterior she'd worn all my life. Something between defeat and desperation. I buzzed her in. She entered without speaking, clutching her purse as though it might anchor her in place. I didn't offer her tea. Didn't ask her to sit. I let her fumble for words in the foyer of the home she'd once called too sterile, too corporate, too lonely looking. Now she looked at it like it was a cathedral. I saw the articles, she finally whispered, eyes flickering toward the living room but never settling. The photos. The speech. You looked so poised. Is that what you came to say? I asked, keeping my voice neutral, not cold, just controlled. She shook her head, eyes glistening now. I came because I was wrong. We were wrong. It hung in the air, heavy and overdue. You didn't just leave us out, she continued. You erased us. You made us invisible. I laughed, quietly but without amusement. Isn't that what you all did to me? For years? She flinched. That wasn't the same. No, I agreed, it wasn't. When you excluded me, it was deliberate. When I excluded you, it was earned. She sank onto the edge of the couch, hands trembling. I didn't know it would go this far. I thought you were just angry. I thought you'd come around eventually. Like you always did. That was the problem, I said, leaning against the doorframe. You always assumed I'd fold. That I'd keep showing up even when there was no room for me. That I'd keep giving even when you all kept taking. And when I stopped, it wasn't rebellion, it was survival. I didn't want to believe. Caleb was capable of, she paused, choking on her words, of lying to us. Of taking what wasn't his. But now I wonder if I ever really saw him clearly. You didn't, I replied without cruelty. Just truth. You didn't want to. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't empty. It was swollen with years of overlooked slights, unpaid debts, rewritten family memories. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of envelopes, tied together with string. She placed them on the coffee table. Letters, she said. From your grandmother. Some addressed to you. Some about you. I found them while cleaning out the attic. She knew. She always knew you were different. Not harder. Not colder. Just stronger than we deserved. I stared at the bundle without touching it. She tried to warn me once, my mother added, voice cracking. She said if I kept putting all the light into one child, I'd raise shadows in the others. I finally sat down, though I kept my distance. Do you want forgiveness? She looked at me slowly, tired. I want to understand. Even if it's too late. That was the first honest thing she'd said since stepping into the house. I nodded once. Not acceptance. Not absolution. Just acknowledgement. We talked for a long time after that. Not about birthdays missed or gifts stolen. But about patterns. About generations of silencing women who didn't fit the mold. About the way invisibility becomes inherited unless someone breaks the chain. She cried, yes. But more importantly, she listened. And for the first time, I believed she actually heard. When she left, I didn't feel relief. I felt released. Later that evening, I untied the string from the letters and began reading. Handwritten notes from a woman who had seen the writing on the wall long before I did. You're going to make them uncomfortable, Brielle, one letter read. And that's your gift, not your flaw. I pressed that note to my chest and let the truth settle deeper than any apology ever could, because I wasn't born to be accepted. I was born to be undeniable. It had been almost a month since my mother's visit. Since then, the atmosphere around me had changed, not in dramatic, cinematic ways, but in quiet shifts I could feel beneath the surface. The silence from most of my extended family remained. But there was no more guessing. No more gaslighting. No more questions about whether the pain I carried was real or imagined. I knew now. I knew who had stood by while I was erased. I knew who had turned their back. And I knew exactly what I had survived. Then, out of nowhere, came Caleb. I was walking home from a late meeting with our international compliance team, the sky dusted with the last shades of twilight, when my phone buzzed. A message. Just a name on the screen I hadn't seen in over a year. Caleb. I froze mid-step, heart slowing but pulsing harder, like my body wasn't sure whether to brace for rage or heartbreak. I tapped the notification, and there it was, his message. As casual as if no betrayal had ever happened. I saw the keynote. You looked strong. I guess I just wanted to say. I didn't know how far you'd take it. But you always said you would. You were right. No apology. No real ownership. Just a strange blend of admiration and self-pity, laced with that same detached tone he always used when deflecting responsibility. I stood there under the street lamp, phone glowing in my hand, feeling a strange ache in my chest, not for him. Not anymore, but for the version of me who once needed his approval. Who would have read that message and clung to it like it was oxygen? But that woman no longer lived here. Still, I didn't delete it. I reread it, over and over, as if searching between the lines for something human, something real, something not curated for optics or crafted for damage control. Eventually, I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at the screen. Not out of indecision, but strategy. Because I was no longer reacting, I was choosing. So I wrote back, not a plea. Not a confrontation, just one sentence. Meet me where it started, if you want to say more. It was deliberate. And I already knew he'd understand exactly what I meant. 3 days later, I drove to the old community center where we'd first started our tutoring nonprofit back in college, the project that launched both our resumes. And, eventually, our separate ambitions. It was empty now, shuttered during the pandemic, the playground behind it rusted and sun-bleached. But the parking lot was still there. And so was Caleb. He looked older. Tired. No longer the polished, magazine cover version of success he'd been trying to build when he stepped over me to get there. His suit didn't quite fit right anymore. His eyes darted, unsure of their welcome. I didn't get out of the car right away. I watched him approach the driver's side window slowly, cautiously, like someone trying to pet a wild animal. When I rolled the window down, he exhaled hard. "You came," he said softly. "You reached out," I replied. We sat in silence, a gentle breeze lifting dust from the pavement around us. Finally, he spoke again. "I didn't know how much damage I caused," he admitted. "Or maybe I did, and I just convinced myself you'd recover like always. You were always the strong one. You never broke." "That's the problem," I said. "You thought that meant it didn't hurt." He nodded, lips tightening. "I didn't just take the company. I took the credit. The spotlight. And I let them paint you as ungrateful when you fought back." "You didn't just let them," I said sharply. "You handed them the brush." He looked down, silent. "I didn't expect you to build all this," he whispered after a while. "Not without them. Not without me." "I didn't need you," I said evenly. "I needed peace. And you weren't it." He winced. "I came because I thought maybe we could rebuild something. Not like before. But something honest." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, I saw not the traitor who took my idea and twisted it, but the scared little boy underneath the armor. The one who needed validation so badly, he'd burn bridges just to warm his hands over the flames. I took a breath. "Caleb," I said. "I'm not angry anymore. But I don't owe you a seat at the table just because you're finally hungry. I've rebuilt everything from scratch. Not just the business, but my boundaries. And I'm not breaking them to make room for someone who only shows up after the feast is over." He blinked, tears forming. "But I didn't look away." "I forgive you," I added, voice steady. "Not for your sake. For mine. But we're not going back. Not to anything." He nodded slowly, accepting it, not with joy, not even with grace, but with a kind of weary respect. Then he stepped back, hands raised in quiet surrender, and I drove away, not because I was running, but because I had already arrived. The air in the office that morning felt different, charged, electric, like something tectonic was about to shift beneath the polished marble floors and glass-paneled walls. My team had been working for months on the expansion rollout, and now we were just 1 week away from the press conference that would change everything. Not just for Polaris Data Labs, but for me. Because for the first time, my name wasn't going to be buried in footnotes or buried behind some co-founder who'd stolen credit under the banner of collaboration. No. This time, the spotlight was mine to claim, or to refuse. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 47th floor boardroom, watching the city below bustle and blink, and felt the familiar churn in my chest. Not fear, at least. Not anymore. But a question. A persistent, nagging one that had lived inside me longer than I cared to admit. Would telling the full story make me whole? Or would it simply drag me back into the trenches I'd worked so hard to climb out of? The board had made it clear, if I wanted to share my personal journey during the launch, they supported me. In fact, they encouraged it. They said transparency humanized leadership. That the story of betrayal, theft, family fracture, and ultimate resilience was a brand asset now. They meant well. But I wasn't sure how I felt about my life being framed as marketable content. Across the room, Harper, my communications director, waited with a folder of prepared talking points. She had been nothing but respectful, but I could see it in her eyes. She thought I should go for it. Use this moment. Own it fully. Reclaim not just the company, but the narrative. "Do you want to include the family angle in the press run?" she asked gently, sliding the folder toward me. "You don't have to go deep. Just enough to make the audience understand what you overcame." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared down at the printed version of the keynote. Phrases like, "founded after a personal turning point, forged in adversity," and "a survivor of betrayal turned visionary" glared up at me like headlines already written. I could hear the media outlets lining up their segments, from Dassault to Data Queen, the woman who lost everything, then built a billion-dollar empire, but none of it felt like victory, because the truth was, I hadn't lost everything. I'd lost people who were never really mine to begin with. I hadn't built an empire, I'd built an escape route. Every sleepless night, every signed deal, every office light that stayed on until sunrise, it was a breadcrumb trail away from the wreckage, and now I was standing at the edge of the cliff, unsure whether to leap into full exposure or step back into privacy. What if I don't want to be the story? I finally asked Harper. She nodded slowly. "Then we won't make you one. The work speaks loud enough. You don't need to explain what you've endured to validate what you've achieved." But that wasn't the full answer either, because deep down, I knew I didn't want silence to look like shame. I wanted silence to be power. I wanted restraint to feel like control, not fear. And most of all, I didn't want them, any of them, to think I had stayed quiet because I was afraid of what they might say. I left the boardroom without taking the folder. That night, I went home and opened a private journal I hadn't touched in years. Inside were entries from before everything fell apart, scribbled affirmations, startup projections, goals written in pencil because I didn't yet trust myself to commit them to ink. And one sentence, circled in thick red pen, stared back at me from the middle of a page. "One day, they'll ask how you did it. And you won't need to answer." That was the moment I made my decision. The next morning, I walked into our recording studio and filmed a short personal statement, not for the press, not for the brand, but for our archives. A sealed testimony. A timestamp of truth, should the world ever need it. Then I stepped in front of the cameras at the official launch event. The lights were hot, the room was packed, and every reporter leaned forward with pens poised, ready for the scandal-laced soundbite, but I gave them something else. I spoke about innovation, about strategy, about the future of tech equity and accessible infrastructure. I spoke about our company's commitment to ethical data use, our global initiatives, our vision. I answered questions with precision. I smiled, not as a mask, but as a declaration. And when one reporter asked, "What motivated you to keep going when it got hard?" I replied without hesitation, "Silence." Their silence. It taught me how to listen to my own voice. No names. No dragging. No public shaming, just enough light to cast a long shadow, and that was enough. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed and congratulations poured in, I stood backstage and felt the weight lift, not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer defined me. I had chosen my story. And in choosing it, I had freed myself from the version they tried to write for me. It happened the week after the launch, when the cameras were packed away, the headlines had quieted, and life began folding itself back into a rhythm that felt almost normal. I was going through storage boxes at the old downtown unit I hadn't visited in years. Most of it was junk, outdated branding materials, prototypes from our earliest product iterations, and stacks of unused business cards with obsolete titles. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just clearing out what no longer fit this chapter of my life, but in the bottom of a weathered banker's box labeled Archive A, beneath folders of old wireframe sketches and partnership agreements, I found an envelope taped to the back of a faded blueprint. It had no name on it. Just the word, "Read," scrawled in unmistakable cursive I hadn't seen since the last Christmas Grandma Josephine was still alive. My heart slowed as I peeled it open, the sound of the paper tearing far louder than it should have been. Inside was a single sheet of stationery from her nursing home. And the handwriting, shaky but deliberate, poured out something I hadn't expected. "Brielle, darling, if you're reading this, it means they finally started building something new, something real. And I hope, with everything in me, that your name is on the wall." My breath caught. They never understood you. Not really. But I did. I watched them praise your obedience and punish your brilliance. I watched them use your talents as a buffer for their inadequacies. And I stayed quiet too long. That's my regret. Tears blurred my vision, but I kept going. That's why I added your name to the patent. Quietly. Legally. You'll find the documents behind the divider labeled Z3. Don't let them tell the story without you, sweetheart. You were always the architect. Never just a builder. I dropped the letter, hands trembling, and yanked open the accordion file labeled Z3. And there it was. A notarized addendum from 2017, back when I was still drafting concept specs with Caleb, before the betrayal, before the lies. The patent that launched the original project had an undisclosed co-inventor.me.my name, my signature, my claim, sealed and archived in silence, waiting for the day I need proof that I hadn't just imagined my contribution. Grandma had protected me in a way no one else had. Quietly, surgically, with the long vision of a woman who'd survived her own erasures, and suddenly, everything shifted. The keynote. The lawsuit Caleb's firm had quietly dropped. The way the board had never once questioned my authority. They all knew. Or at least, they had the means to know, and chose not to contest it. Perhaps they'd seen this document. Perhaps Grandma had ensured a copy found its way to the right inbox after her passing. She had left breadcrumbs in the shadows. Not so. I'd follow them, but so I could claim what was already mine when I was ready. I sat there on the concrete floor for what felt like hours, rereading her words. Each sentence wrapped around my ribs like armor, not the kind that shields you from pain, but the kind that helps you stand taller through it. Later that evening, I called our lead attorney. I didn't need to sue Caleb. Not anymore. But I wanted the record amended. I wanted the co-inventorship acknowledged. Not for vengeance. Not for headlines. For history. You want it public? The lawyer asked. No, I said. I want it permanent. And with that, I sealed the past with ink. Not rage. Not revenge. Just truth. That weekend, I returned to the house I now called home, a space filled with clean lines, quiet light, and walls that had never witnessed cruelty. I stood in my study and framed the letter. Not to display it. Just to preserve it, because legacy, I had learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a folded note tucked behind a blueprint, waiting to remind you who you were before they tried to rewrite your story, and this time, they wouldn't get the final word. The first snow fell in late November, soft and slow, covering the city in a hush that made even the traffic sound reverent. I sat by the window of my home, a space no one gave me, no one tricked me out of, no one tried to claim, watching the flakes collect on the sill while Madison, my Labrador, slept curled at my feet. There was no music playing. No television buzzing in the background. Just the stillness that comes when a storm has finally passed and you're left standing, wind-battered but unshaken. It had been nearly 18 months since the last time I'd spoken to most of my family. Since the betrayal. Since the lies. Since the day they made it crystal clear that my worth to them was conditional, valuable only when convenient, disposable once I set boundaries. They hadn't reached out again. Not after the launch. Not after the article quietly confirmed my name on the patent. Not even after Mom must have discovered that the nursing home donation in Grandma Josephine's name came from me, and honestly, I was fine with that, because some silences aren't punishments. They're upgrades. The company was thriving, no. Not just thriving, evolving. We'd opened offices in Berlin and Singapore, expanded into education access tech, and launched a scholarship foundation for underrepresented girls in STEM. Every part of it felt intentional. Not a distraction. Not an overcorrection. Just alignment. Like every painful detour had somehow still delivered me exactly where I needed to be. I'd hired a new CTO, someone who reminded me of myself when I was starting out. Brilliant. Underestimated. Tired of pretending she wasn't the smartest person in the room. Watching her pitch her first prototype to the board reminded me why I'd fought so hard in the first place. It was never about revenge. It was always about room. Making room for women like her. Like me. Like the teenage girl I once was, sketching out code on graph paper between library shifts while everyone else partied in basements. I was never invited to point one afternoon, while sorting through storage bins for a local donation drive, I found the old vision wall I'd built in my first solo apartment. It was just a foam board, covered in clipped magazine headlines, scribbled mantras, and post-it notes that had long lost their stick. But right in the middle was one phrase in black permanent marker: I will build a life so solid they can't knock it over, even when they pretend not to see it. I smiled, not because it made me nostalgic, but because it was no longer aspirational. It was done. I had built it. With my own hands. With no blueprint but instinct. With no scaffolding but resilience, and the most poetic part? I didn't need them to see it. The ones who dismissed me, who twisted truth into manipulation, who labeled me difficult for refusing to fold, none of them mattered anymore. Not because I'd erased the pain, but because I'd outgrown their capacity to affect me. Forgiveness had come quietly, like the snow, soft, unannounced, covering the jagged edges of old memories with something smoother. Not to erase them, but to make them easier to walk across. I forgave Caleb, not because he earned it, but because I refused to carry his shadow into my next chapter. I forgave my mother, not for her silence, but because I now understood her voice had been stifled long before I was ever born. But I didn't invite them back, because closure, I'd learned, doesn't require reconciliation. It requires release. That night, I lit a fire in the fireplace, not symbolic, not dramatic, just warm. I poured a glass of red wine, the expensive kind I used to think was too indulgent, and sat down with the book I'd been meaning to finish for months. For once, my mind wasn't racing toward the next goal. There was no battle to win. No approval to earn. Just the fullness of being enough, completely, without needing permission. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. I looked out the window, watching the world glow in winter's hush, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt not just peaceful, but proud, not of the revenge, not of the company, but of the fact that I didn't let any of it break me. I simply built a better version of everything they tried to take, and that was the legacy that mattered.